Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Susan Brewer. She's a historian who has worked spent her career working in foreign policy, but has investigated her own personal history, and that's what she's talking about today. And I'm very excited that she's able to join us today from upstate New York. Her book, The Best Land, 400 Years of Love and Betrayal on Oneida Territory, has just been published by the Cornell University Press. Strongly encourage you to go to Cornell's site and order it directly from them, or favor your local bookshop and order it through them. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Susan.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Jamie and Lauren and everyone. The Best Land is about the farm I grew up on in Oneida, New York. And when I was a child, everything seemed so settled. My grandparents lived next door. Aunts and uncles and cousins came to visit. For me, the land was about the family, and the family was about the place we lived. Then when I was in high school in the 1970s, the Oneida Indians claimed that New York State had acquired their land illegally, and they won their cases in court. I remember having conflicted feelings. I thought the Oneidas were probably right, and I did not want to lose our family farm. So everything that had seemed so settled now was unsettled. In seventh grade social studies class, I had learned that the Oneidas were Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse, also known as the Five Nations or the Iroquois Confederacy. They were the original inhabitants, but they had disappeared from our history books after the American Revolution. Native people, I assumed, belonged in the past. So I wondered what had happened in Oneida and why didn't I know anything about it? These questions stayed with me as I went away to college and graduate school and became a professor of American history. I decided to investigate the history of our farm, which I once had heard my grandfather call the best land in Madison County, and the stories of the two families who had called it home. So I knew that my great-grandparents, Frank and Jenny Clement Brewer, had bought the land from the grandchildren of Polly Denny and her husband, Angel DeFerrier. And before that the land had belonged to the Oneidas. So I traced my family of European settlers and Polly's Oneida Mohawk family to find out where they were from and how they came to live on the best land. To my astonishment, I discovered that Polly's family and mine had been neighbors for 3 centuries. They lived distinctive yet connected lives. My grandfather called the farm the best land because of its flat, fertile fields. Others considered it to be the best land because it was crossed by the most important east-west passageway in North America, the only relatively flat route by water or land through the Appalachian mountain range. So people could travel up the Hudson River through the Mohawk Valley to Oneida Lake and reach the Great Lakes. The Haudenosaunee knew the power and importance of this location. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European colonizers fought for control over it. General George Washington considered it to be vital, and New York State could not wait to get its hands on it. Our farm was crossed by the Great Genesee Road, also known as the Seneca Turnpike, or today Route 5, which across the best land to the south of this aerial photograph of our farm taken in the 1960s. The Erie Canal crossed the best land back here. And when I was a kid, the New York Central Railroad went in front of our farm. And then in the 1950s, the New York State Thruway passed our farm to the north. This transportation system transformed Oneida Land, New York State, and the United States. I did not understand any of this when I was a kid. It's not that I thought that the Erie Canal went through everybody's backyard. I just took it for granted that it went through ours. So I'll take the next 25 minutes to discuss 400 years of history, and then I will welcome your questions. So the earliest known written account by a European of the Oneidas was recorded in 1634 by Harman Minderts van den Bogart, who was my 9th great-grandfather. Harman was an employee of the Dutch West India Company who was sent out from Fort Orange, which is now Albany, to secure the fur trade with the Mohawks and the Oneidas. On his journey, Harman traveled through forests of oak, beech, and birch. He saw longhouses filled with furs, grains, nuts, dried meat, fish, and berries. While the men led hunting parties and managed the fishing, the women directed the farming, using exemplary agricultural practices developed over generations. By disrupting the soil as little as possible, the women planted the revered three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, to grow together. Harman's account reveals a contradiction. The Europeans, with their Christianity and technology, felt superior to the people they called savages, yet they were deeply dependent on these same people for trade, security, abundant and healthy food, and navigating the waterways and dense forests. In the 18th century, my family and Polly's lived as neighbors in the Mohawk Valley. In 1768, the British rulers of the colony of New York promised the Haudenosaunee that the line of property separating English territory from Indian territory would protect native land from white encroachment. Defiant colonists objected to any sort of boundary line. The boundary line, which ran through Oneida Territory, placed the Oneidas on the front line during the American Revolution. The Oneidas, including Polly's family, broke with their Haudenosaunee brothers and sisters when they took the side of the rebels against the British Empire. Throughout the violent and destructive years of fighting in the Mohawk Valley, my ancestors and Polly's family fought alongside each other. In gratitude for the Oneidas' significant service as warriors, scouts, and diplomats, the United States, by treaty, guaranteed that the Oneidas would be secure in the possession of the lands on which they were settled. At the end of the war, General George Washington toured the Mohawk Valley and Oneida Lake. He claimed it as a new empire, although he too had promised the Oneidas that their land would be secure. So New York State, meanwhile, proceeded to ignore federal law and conduct treaties of land cession with the Oneidas using deceit and corruption. By the 1790s, the Oneidas had less than 300,000 acres left out of their original 6 million. So the Oneidas had reserved, with this 300,000 acres, their excellent farmland along the creeks that ran down the hills into Oneida Lake. Polly's family relocated and settled on the best land, which is here where Quaslong Creek crosses the main road. And my family, my ancestors, squatted illegally on Oneida land in the hills to the south. So across the main road, which went right through Oneida Territory, traveled Haudenosaunee runners, wagon trains of settlers heading west, and European tourists. Several visitors commented on the depth and richness of Oneida soils. They also complained about how bad the road was. A 14-year-old girl from New Jersey stopped in an inn next to the best land. She thought it was sad to see enormous piles of burning trees because she thought it was a waste of good firewood. She changed her mind when the driver of her carriage had to stop repeatedly because the road was blocked by fallen trees. So after long delays, while she waited for him to take out his axe and chop up enormous logs and branches before they could be pushed out of the way, she decided she was no longer sad to see such good wood burn. The sound of the axe is heard everywhere, noted a Dutch land developer with satisfaction. A German geologist disapproved. He observed that the settlers had left millions of stumps and half-burned trees crisscrossed over one another. The sight, he thought, would make a German forester cry. This illustration from a 19th century local history shows the first phase in the pioneer's transformation of the forest. He chops down trees to make a clearing and build a cabin. One of my forefathers was part of a group who founded an iron company, which took advantage of all the available fuel. It used the trees cleared by settlers to burn fires hot enough to smelt iron ore, which was made into kettles, stoves, and casings for plows. This company, after 30 years of operation, closed when the available trees all had been burned. The second phase shows a rough road to the cabin with a log bridge over the stream. The pioneer has cleared more land and fenced in a garden. His livestock runs free, and that the running of the livestock and the foraging of the livestock into Oneida fields caused the Oneidas to complain that the cows and pigs of white settlers were destroying their crops. By this time, the Oneidas had become more dependent on farming because their hunting grounds were gone, and the increase in settlement meant that there was much less game available. So in this third phase, a frame house has been added to the log cabin. A substantial barn has been built. The fields are plowed and planted. More land has been cleared. An orchard established. The road now passes in front of the farm with a substantial bridge crossing the stream. And in the back, there's a mill on this stream as well. And I want you to notice that the trees along the stream have been cut down. In one of their treaties with New York State, the Oneidas had stipulated that the woods on either side of Fish Creek, described at the time as extraordinarily rich in fish, especially salmon, should not be cut down in order to preserve the creek and the fishing. This stipulation was ignored. There and elsewhere, the trees along the streams came down, the high banks eroded, and sediment filled the bottom. The fishing declined as streams flooded higher in the spring and dried up in the summer. These illustrations of pioneer progress are misleading. First, there are no natives present. The Oneidas traded with the settlers, showed them how to make maple syrup, and helped with barn raisings. Some newcomers settled on clearings already made by the Oneidas in cabins built by the Oneidas. Second, many settlers, including most of my ancestors, did not experience such progress as depicted. Illness, injury, early frost, or drought were just some of the reasons early settlers failed. Many gave up, moved on, or became tenant farmers, as did members of my family. Indeed, these illustrations better represent what happened to Polly's family than to mine. In the early 1800s, Polly's family enjoyed affluence on the best land, shown here in its first survey. As speakers of several languages, Polly's family served natives and newcomers as go-betweens. Her brother lived here. He was the tribal interpreter. Her nephew, who could read and write English, lived here on what was then still Oneida Territory. And Polly and her husband and her extended family lived at this important site on the turnpike where it was crossed by Cowaslone Creek. Polly's French husband, Angel de Ferrier, was an agent of the Oneidas who granted him land in return for his service to them. And Polly and Angel took advantage of their location to build an inn, mills on the creek, and a blacksmith shop to attract settlers. When New York State decided to build a canal to connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie, it needed one more piece of Oneida land, and that was the best land. So in 1815, the state, with Angel de Ferrier's help, negotiated a treaty made without federal approval as required by law that included this first tract. By this time, many Oneidas believed that Angel had betrayed their trust. The state built the canal through lots 2, 3, and 4. And then when the canal was finished, it awarded the land to Angel de Ferrier. Then Angel and Polly sold dozens of lots to settlers and kept the best land in the family. The explosion of population and commerce along the Erie Canal increased the value of the land throughout the state by $100 million, according to a newspaper of the day. The canal system also affected the Oneida's fishing. Oneida chiefs protested the plan to build a dam on the Oswego River. They said that by treaty, New York State had promised them the right of fishing and hunting forever. The proposed dam, 18 feet high, would block the salmon run. The Oneidas said they would accept a lower dam that the salmon could jump over. The officials replied that the engineers required the dam at the proposed height to feed the canals and promised that if the construction harmed the Oneida fisheries, the state would make it right, which it did not. So the era of the Erie Canal was also the era of Indian removal, when federal and state authorities pushed for the relocation of Native people to the West. Some Oneidas moved to Wisconsin and others to Canada. Their leave-taking was not as deadly as the forced removal of the southeastern natives known as the Trail of Tears, but it was full of difficulty and heartbreak. So those who remained on their ancestral lands in Oneida, as did a few of Polly's relatives, were called the home party. So the Oneidas held on to a reservation labeled here as the Oneida Reservation of 1840. It's about 800 acres off the main road south of the city of Oneida. A census taker noted that the Oneidas were successful farmers whose houses and barns were nicer than those of their white neighbors. So Chief Christian Beechtree, for example, was better off than his next door neighbor, my fourth great grandfather. The Oneidas set up schools, founded one of the earliest Methodist churches in the area, and won prizes for best horses and needlework at the local fair. They continued to demand their treaty rights to no avail. State officials said, quote, "If the Indians with whom the treaty was made had represented an educated and civilized people, they would have understood that their ceded territory would be transformed by white inhabitants who would have exclusive control as property owners." So this map from 1875 shows the best land here, where the turnpike crosses the bottom, the canal comes through here, and then the addition of the New York Central Railroad through the middle. Polly's children lived on the turnpike here, and her youngest daughter and her husband farmed the best land. The Oneida Reservation, which is over here on the lower right-hand corner, is no longer identified as a reservation on this map, even though several Oneida families still live there. The state pressured the Oneidas to assimilate, which to the authorities meant to become civilized. The state required the Oneidas to own their property as individuals rather than communally as a nation. As a result, Oneida land became more vulnerable to fraud and foreclosures as white people, including my family, crowded around. Without their land, the poverty of the Oneidas increased. As part of the push for assimilation, the state closed the Oneida schools. Oneida children were taken to boarding schools, or they attended a public school like this one, and this is Polly's great-great niece here, shown here, fourth from the left. In the 1890s, Polly's grandchildren needed a tenant to work their farm. They hired my great-grandfather, Frank, who moved there with his wife, Jenny. So my grandfather, DeVerne, and his siblings were born in the tenant house on the land of Polly's family. Around the time this picture was taken in the early 1900s, my family became the owners of the best land by buying it from Polly's grandchildren. At about the same time, the Oneidas almost lost their last territory in New York State. The 32 acres was the home of Mary Hanyost Shenandoah. In the Oneida tradition, Mary's home was passed down to her by the women in her family and had never been out of Native hands. She was in her 70s when she and her family were evicted over a disputed mortgage. The Oneidas took the case to court. During the trial, Mary's nephew, this is Mary, this is her nephew, Chief William Hanyost Rockwell, was asked a question. A lawyer asked Chief Rockwell, how could the Oneidas be regarded as Indians if they worked and dressed like white people and did not live by hunting and fishing? According to this line of questioning, the Oneidas should lose their land because they were not viewed as real Indians. The judge said that it did not matter what the Oneidas wore or how they made a living. In a rare and significant victory for the Oneidas, the judge ruled that according to federal law, the state did not have the power or the authority to terminate the tribe, and that the land belonged to the Oneidas. Chief Rockwell lived on the 32-acre Oneida Territory for decades. Here he is in a newspaper photograph taken in the 1950s. Chief Rockwell often wore a Plains Indian headdress at public events. I suspect he thought that white people would recognize him as a native if he dressed like the Indians they saw at the movies or on TV. What he is doing here is handing out the treaty cloth given to the Oneidas by the federal government every year in accordance with the Treaty of Canandaigua made between the Haudenosaunee and the United States in 1794. As Chief Rockwell often remarked, it was good that the federal government continued to uphold the promise of delivering the treaty cloth. The cloth, however, was only a symbol of the promise the United States had made to guarantee Oneida land. Chief Rockwell urged the United States to honor the treaty in full and restore the land of his people. By the 1970s, the Oneidas took their land claims cases to the courts. This newspaper article illustrates a perspective regarding property that I remember hearing at the time. It shows on the bottom right a photograph of the Oneida Territory of 32 acres, where the Oneidas lived in trailers provided by the federal government. The mobile homes suggest a temporary presence as opposed to the farm shown above, which is identified as belonging to a local farmer for 3 decades. The caption quotes the farmer asking, "How would you feel if everything you had in the world for most of your life might be taken from you?" There's no recognition that if anybody knew how it would feel to lose your land, it would be the Oneidas. In part, there was no recognition because few residents knew the history of the Oneidas. Like me, they had learned at school and, at the movies that Indians belonged in the past, not the present. And this perception was reinforced by local histories and maps that ignored or erased the presence of Native people. By the early 2000s, there had been a reversal of fortunes as illustrated by the front page of the local paper. Our farm, like many area farms in hard times, had been sold. The best land was being eyed as an industrial site convenient to the railroad and the New York State Thruway. It eventually was acquired by a controlled environment agriculture operation that grows acres of tomatoes, cucumbers, and strawberries in greenhouses. My nephew was distressed that the prime topsoil maintained by the Oneidas, by Polly's family, and by mine was bulldozed away to build the greenhouses. The Oneidas, meanwhile, had built a fabulously profitable casino on the Thruway and become the biggest employer in the region. The article below this photograph of the best land is about Oneida Nation representatives and other Native leaders visiting the White House. They met with President George W. Bush, who issued an executive memorandum ordering all federal agencies to respect tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Meanwhile, the court cases over land claims dragged on. A landowners group called Upstate Citizens for Equality picketed at Oneida-owned businesses waving American flags. To this group, equality meant assimilation, not sovereignty and self-determination. Hateful things were said as the people of Oneida disagreed over who belonged and who did not. "11 years ago, the Oneida Indian Nation negotiated a gaming compact with New York State that has laid to rest the land claims for the time being. The Oneidas have bought back several thousand acres from willing sellers and put them into federal trust. For decades, Oneida men and women worked for local farmers. Now some of the descendants of those farmers work for the Oneida Nation. The decline of farming has meant the return of the forests. The twists and turns continue. Conflicted feelings remain, along with degrees of division and reconciliation. The story of the Best Land is many stories. It is the story of greed, betrayal, and corruption. It is the story of how, over the centuries, Americans told the Oneidas that if they did not live like white people, they were uncivilized and not worthy of their land. And then when they did live like white people, they were no longer real Indians and therefore not entitled to their land. It is a story of how the Oneidas persistently tried to persuade the United States and New York State to uphold their own laws and promises. And it is a story of two families, Polly's and mine, who loved the place they called home and whose histories have been intertwined for 400 years.
Susan, thank you so much. You did, I have to commend you for covering 400 years in a very, and I apologize if I don't quite get, if the compliment doesn't land correctly, but to cover 400 years in such a short amount of time, but so clearly, concisely, and lucidly, I'm very impressed as somebody who struggles to talk about the last 15 minutes in under an hour, you know? Thank you. As I said, I apologize. I don't think that compliment landed the way, but
I
uh,
admit I left some things out.
well, and that is why, folks, the book fills in so much. But for now, we're going to attempt to fill some gaps with some questions. Um, and I don't know if this is in the book or not, but towards the very end, you mentioned that the Oneidas have a successful casino. And if this is not within the boundaries of your study, please let me know. But I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the impact of the casino and I assume a good deal of income, how that has helped, or what the impact of that has been on the land ownership and what sounds like some continuing struggles there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the Oneida started with holding bingo games, and then they built a casino and a resort, and they have built championship golf courses. They've bought marinas. They've built campgrounds. They have built other casinos in the area. So they have really expanded, and they own businesses, gas stations and convenience stores, and they've really expanded and I think diversified. And with those profits, they have built a lot of housing so that Oneidas can return to the area if they wish, and they've built provided health care for all the people, their people. They've provided free higher education for all Oneida children. They have, and all of this has been both applauded and become very controversial just because of clashes over jurisdiction, the gap between the enormous wealth created and then the kind of upstate New York's decline in farming and manufacturing it's a big contrast. So I think in many ways, the Oneida success has been very much welcomed by local businesses and people who understand that this has become a revenue building engine. But then there's all this controversy also over taxes and jurisdiction and does the sovereign nation have to follow environmental regulations or not? Who says? And I think that's why this is a very hard question to answer clearly and directly, because it really in many ways depends on who you ask how you're going to get an answer to that question. And also, I should say there's divisions within the Oneidas over traditionalists who oppose gaming and see that as a corrupting influence, and those who are quite proud of what has been accomplished. So
Thank you.
very different, very diverse points of view is what I'm saying. Yes.
Yes, and this sounds familiar in that wherever casinos have been built by Native American peoples, controversy follows. I'll leave it at that, because there are so many viewpoints. But I appreciate that you took a stab at that, because it was not easy. I'm going to start with a question from Hugh Canham, who he was one of the regional neighbors I alluded to earlier. He's in the Oswego area. And he's a retired faculty member from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He says, several of my students developed a management plan for managing some of the emerging woodlands and old fields on the reservation. Do you know if anything came of that? He's been retired for 22 years, so this is why Hugh is a little disconnected from that information. He said they had nice houses and seemed more interested in the casino than on doing something with the land, as the traditions suggested. But back to his question, do you know what may have become of the emerging woodlands and old fields?
Yes, some of them. So this was land that was cleared by my ancestors, and the Oneidas now own farms that used to belong to my family. They initially had a large farm themselves, but that has been closed down, and now it is just left. Area people say it's all going back to nature, is how it's been described to me a number of times. And that I know that is sad for local farmers to see happening, but but I don't know why or if there is a plan. But I do know that the plan to initially farm this land was put to an end, and now there are just trees growing up in old silos, kind of thing. So that's what's happened there. But it does, they've bought back, thousands of acres, and they're doing different things with different parts of it.
Okay. Doug McCleary says that your narrative about the stages of clearing and development of the land by whites and displacement of indigenous peoples is quite similar to that told by William Cronin in his book Changes in the Land, which focuses on New England. But his question actually goes back to the earliest documents or documentation by Europeans, like Vander Bogart, was it?
Yes, Van Bogart, yes.
Yeah. Did Europeans like him describe management practices that the native peoples were using in forested areas, such as using fire to improve the land for game habitat and things like that, or clearing for agriculture? I don't know how much time you spent reading into those early documents, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I Van Bogart is he's not a trained farmer. He was a barber surgeon for the on the ships for the Dutch West India Company. And so I think he was selected for this mission when he was 22 years old because he could read and write, and is, a sort of educated man who was trained to observe. And, his journal, he's only there for several days. He's not there long enough to really observe the practices. And he is trying to pick up the language. He keeps a whole journal of the language, but some things like he doesn't. He writes down the Mohawk word for raccoon, but he doesn't know where the raccoon is, so he calls it a cat. He's not. I would. I don't. I wouldn't count on him to observe the practices. And I don't know enough of the other early accounts to know about the management. I mean, I've read other scholars write about those management practices that they've gleaned over time. What I would say from the sources I read, which would be more about ordinary settlers like my family, is that they respected them and were impressed by them, but really considered the European system superior. So they wanted to use plows. They wanted men to do the farming, not the women. They didn't take seriously the women as the mistresses of the soil, as the Haudenosaunee called them. So I feel like there's that constant contradiction of admiring and then underrating at the same time. So, and so I wouldn't be surprised if ordinary settlers also came to, that same attitude about management practices as well, not really totally understand or respect everything that they're doing to manage their lands.
So you mentioned, well, I'm very curious about the documents you were able to use. What materials in your family were available to you? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Not only, yeah, my family, they were, Harmon Vanden Bogart would be an exception of somebody who could read and write. By the time they're living in the Mohawk Valley, they're not, I don't think they're getting a lot of education. My family, I could learn about them through church records and military records and court records. So records typically kept by other people, not them. Um, and I think my family, like the Oneida and Mohawk families, relied much more on an oral tradition.
Okay.
And formal schooling was limited for most of them. But what I could find out, I found out in letters, and the official records I named, where I could.
Okay. So you did not have family journals or diaries, things like that to draw from
I did later.
later? Okay.
Yeah, my great-grandfather kept diaries of when he started farming the best land, and those are extraordinary to me. They are, how much, all the different kinds of things he did as a farmer. And then
Okay.
also, his father-in-law kept diaries too. A lot of them are very, what was the weather? They're really about when you put the crops in, when you take the crops out, but also what the women of the family are doing. I found those really useful too.
Okay. Caroline Chorkeldson asks, is the Oneida story similar to that of other tribes in the region? I don't know if you did any comparisons or had to look at the histories of other other people's to be able to tell your story?
A little bit, but not very much. I would say I looked at the Haudenosaunee as a whole, but the Oneidas are also set apart from them because they and the Tuscaroras, who joined as the sixth nation in the early 1700s, did side with the U.S. during the American Revolution, and that changed the relationships there. So, but I would say, the Oneidas kept, interacting with the Mohawks, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, but their relationship with the U.S. government was different. And, that had an impact on what happened to the lands of the different members of the Haudenosaunee.
Okay. Mac McClure has what may be a very challenging question, and you'll understand why when I pose it. Do the Native American peoples having wealth create the same jealousies in New York that he says are very similar to that of Native Alaskans who were receiving trust income created by agreements under the Alaskan Pipeline Project? This, is this something you can talk about at all?
I would say there's I would say among some people I have heard people speak with resentment and bitterness. I think that but not everyone. I think that I think other people are quite relieved that the Oneidas are doing so well that their wealth kind of percolates through a little bit. But I would say there's definitely mixed feelings.
Mhm.
And and I suppose in a way those are natural anywhere where there's an obvious gap between wealth and poverty,
Yeah.
But I do think some of it is also tinged by this question of who belongs and who doesn't. Whose land is this really, and
Yeah.
and so I think it has that added component as well. So I would say yes and no.
Yeah. It may be everyone or most people recognize that a rising tide lifts all boats, but then there is resentment about who owns the boats.
Yeah, who gets to have the boats? Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Am I just a sailor on the boat, or am I the captain or the
Am I
owner?
the captain of my own ship?
Yeah.
Yes. Now,
Um,
to me, this is fascinating because it goes back to this early idea that I know my ancestors had about land. I mean, they came from Europe as indentured servants, many of them, and they came because they were promised land. And
mhm.
to them, land always went with freedom and independence. And I think that's a very strong belief in the United States. And land to the Haudenosaunee, to the Oneidas, also meant freedom and independence. And so you have this clash right from the beginning over the land and who gets to be free and independent with the land. So I think that is I really try to address that as a kind of ancient thread that runs through this whole thing.
Yeah. Just a reminder, folks, to place your questions in the Q&A forum. Hugh Canham followed up with he says, you made an interesting point regarding the role of women. He said, when my students and I visited the lands, the Oneida lands, we were accompanied by several women, but no men.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so that I guess supports what you were finding as well.
Mhm. Yes, yes. Um, yes, I've heard that over and over.
Okay.
The men would be the spokesman quite
Okay.
often. But the women also had a say in, governance decisions, um, and still do.
Okay. Um, Now in your presentation, you didn't discuss the role of religion, but my recollection from a million years ago in graduate school was that that region of New York uh, was an area that was, um, I think they referred to it as the burned over land, meaning that
Mhm.
uh, religious fire, if you will, of Christianity spread through that region. And I'm wondering if there's much impact or role or influence or none, little or none, in terms of religion and the perceptions of land and land ownership during this period. Well, specifically in the 1800s when these um, were they basically revivals, I think, were taking
Mhm.
place. Does that have any role here in this
Yes.
history?
Mhm. It does. It does. The Oneidas were hosting a missionary even before the Revolutionary War. So some of them had converted to Christianity already, and others had been converted earlier, especially by French Jesuit priests who were converting people as well. And that caused some divisions, of course. I mean, you have people holding on to traditional beliefs, you had people converting to Roman Catholicism, and people converting to Protestant religion. So, that caused, we know what kind of factions that caused within the European community. Well, it also, caused some splits among the Oneidas. But they also, during the era of the burned over district, the Oneidas hosted Methodist circuit riders, which is why they were one of the first to establish a Methodist church. So yes, I think while other Oneidas um, had already converted to Christianity, so what you see happening with the Oneidas is that many of them are converting to Christianity, but they're also keeping their traditional beliefs. They're also passing down what had been called the pagan party's beliefs about their traditions about the land and spirits on the land, and um, in their festivals that they held uh, uh, throughout the seasons were done to thank the creator and the animals and the plants, and so
Mhm.
they I think they didn't it seems to me from oral histories and hearing from people is that while they converted to Christianity and attended church, they also passed down the old beliefs as well.
Yeah, and this is it's what I call in terms of analogies, this is kind of apples to concrete. But I'm third generation on my mother's side, third generation Greek immigrant. And there's the Greek Orthodox traditions, but then there were within that the family traditions and beliefs. And it was interesting all in retrospect to see how some of those the family and they were superstitions would contradict or be in conflict with the teachings of the church. But nevertheless, it was important to my grandmother and my mother to pass these down to my generation.
Mhm.
Um, and then when the grandchildren started coming along, she was trying to pass those on to them as well. So I understand those challenges, or not challenges, but how there's the rooting yourself in the beliefs of the church, but also in tradition as well, uh,
Mhm.
and through oral tradition at that.
And isn't it interesting in your family, it's through the women as well?
Yes.
Who are passing it. I mean, just, I find that, because from what I've seen, that as it is documented, as we have it, is from the women within the Oneida families as well who are
Mm.
doing.
Also,
Mm.
also, my father was rather reticent, so you couldn't get much out of him. But that said, my mom and her sisters were the keepers of that oral tradition, and all of their children have heard the stories and we're very grateful. You know, when you're children and you hear the story again and again, you don't want to hear it, but now I recognize, and for years I've recognized the importance of the oral tradition. Which brings me to a question I have for you, which is, were you able then, how did you engage with or get to, so oral tradition outside of your family
Mhm.
tree, the Oneida oral tradition, how did you access that information?
I was very lucky to find some written accounts of oral tradition. So, um, for example, a historian at the Wisconsin Historical Society did a number of interviews with Oneidas in the 1870s. So these were
Oh, wow.
people who, remembered what their grandparents had told them, going back. And that was one of my top sources about Polly's family. And um, so thanks to someone doing an interview and
Mhm.
writing down what people said. Um, and the same from a slightly more recent, where a few people have written down what the Oneidas said. So through interviews or collecting stories, and also looking through newspapers, hearings, uh, um, and in the past at treaty councils, Oneidas would speak, and the British or the Americans would write down what they were saying. And
Mhm.
so you would see their whole perspective of what of how they viewed what was happening. So it's sort of ironic. You have to rely on written versions, and those, you have to be careful with that. I don't think the Europeans and the Americans were always super careful about what they wrote down. And in some cases were openly deceitful about what they wrote down. But that's what I've had to rely on. I mean, that's what there is um, finding bits and pieces and trying to put it together is what I did.
Most impressive. Um, I want to finish. Mac McClure was asking for a little bit of clarification, and he wants to know when the Oneida converted to farming. Is-
Oh, well, they always had been farming as far back as we know. They so and it's the women manage the farming, the men the hunting and the fishing, although they all work together.
Mhm.
But it was all done sort of communally with some gender division, but each would participate in the other's uh, area of responsibility. And it seems to have uh, produced a quite balanced um, and abundant food supply for them. The Oneidas are pushed. Farming is associated with being civilized, but also if the Oneidas farmed, they wouldn't need all their hunting ground, of course, which could be then taken or acquired by the state. So
Okay.
the state had an agenda also in pushing the Oneidas to become farmers. They talked about it as being civilized, but they also wanted the Oneidas to give up their hunting grounds. And so as more settlers come and the game diminishes, the Oneidas become more and more reliant on farming. So they're still hunting in the 1800s, but by then they are much more reliant on farming. And actually, as they lose their remaining land, they can no longer actually be farmers. They end up being farm hands for other farmers, or they end up becoming mechanics or day laborers. A lot of the women become domestic servants. You know, they really are no longer even able to really be
Working the land for their own
working the land for other
purposes.
people.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for the presentation and spending this time with us.